I'm Catherine Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect Studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your councillor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Hi everyone, it's TGU time from VLGA Connect. Nice to have you with us. And joining me this week is Tony Rownick from Hunt & Hunt Lawyers and Julie Reid from Julie Reid and, let me get that right. Julie A. Reid and Associates. Good morning to you both.
Morning, Chris.
Great to see you and to have you here to unpack the stories of the week. And look, I know we say this every week, but there's a lot to talk about once more. And going to the top of the hit parade this week is the announcement that came out yesterday of the appointment of the panel of administrators at Moira Shire Council. Now, we knew this was coming. The council was dismissed back in, I think it was March. Hard to remember now, but yeah, a few months ago. And John Tanner's been there as an interim administrator since that time. He's now been confirmed as chair until almost the end of the year, and two panel members to join him. Now, those panel members are Susanna Sheed, the former independent member for Shepparton, and Dr. Graham Emonson, a former local government CEO and a deputy secretary within the Victorian Public Service. So reaction firstly. Tony, your thoughts?
Well, they both, have strong local connections in the area. You mentioned Susanna having been a local member for about 7 or 8 years at Shepparton. Recently that position was filled by Kim O'Keefe. The last elections, of course, former mayor of Shepparton as well. Graham Emonson actually has some history in the area. He was CEO of the Shire of Wangaratta back in the 1990s and has a quite lauded sort of career across metro and regional councils as a CEO, executive director, local government Victoria, president of LG Pro. So certainly well known in the sector. Long appointment for those two recently appointed administrators, 5 years.
More than 5 years. So it's still the first meeting of the council that occurs after the October 2028 elections. So yes, it's a significant period of time.
Yeah, good that we've got people that have a lot of knowledge of that sort of local area, which is fantastic, but also in-depth understanding of local government. And I think Dr. Graham Emonson, who was the Executive Director, Local Government Victoria, will understand very deeply those governance type requirements that need to be squeaky clean and adhered to, and so he'll bring an amazing amount of experience for that particular role. So so look, looks like we're on the way with Moira, trying to make sure that things turn around and are different at the next election.
Yes, indeed. And I'm sure John Tanner's pleased to have some assistance, because a few months in the role by himself I'm sure, would have been pretty taxing. Interesting wording in this. Two things I just wanted to raise with you and get your thoughts on. Interesting wording that Mr. Tanner is appointed chair until the 8th of December this year. And the official press release says, after which further appointments, plural, may be made to the panel, including the appointment of a new chair. So there's two things we could draw from that. Perhaps Mr. Tanner has said that that's as far as he wants to go with the appointment, but it also intimates that there could be more than one appointment additionally made to that panel. So perhaps there's some thoughts about some fresh membership around the end of the year. Am I reading too much into that, Tony?
Yeah, I think the original appointment of Mr. Tanner as chair was described as an interim, an interim appointment as administrator, with this, ultimately the thinking that there would be more long-term administrators appointed, and perhaps it's a sense of continuity with the chair while those two new appointees settle in, and there may well be some changes in the new year.
Julie, you've worked within the state government machine. The other thing that's intimated here is Dr. Emonson is currently a Deputy Secretary in the Victorian Public Service. So are we to assume he's going to be doing both of those roles for the next 5 or so years?
I think we do have to assume that. I've not heard that he's stepping down from that role as Deputy Secretary at this stage, but I think that's just one to watch and see what kind of reaction we get to that. That's quite unusual to see that. We haven't seen that happen in terms of that kind of an appointment. So, yeah, I'm not too sure how sector's going to respond to that, Chris.
My thoughts exactly, Julie, and I've said this before on the program in terms of appointing administrators, appointing municipal monitors. Where are the appropriately qualified people coming from to fill these roles if the government is going to continue with this proactive approach, particularly around appointment of municipal monitors? Could this be a sign that it was very difficult to find someone who perhaps didn't have anything on their plate to step into a role such as an administrator of a busy council, Tony?
Interesting hearing your thoughts on that. And I think I agree with the interpretation there in the language in the ministerial announcement. Dr. Emerson was described as being in that deputy secretarial role, not as intending to step down. Maybe it's just a miscommunication in the language. Let's see if there's any clarity. Haven't seen any announcements on LinkedIn or anything like that in terms of a change in his role.
All right, so that's the news from Moira, the new panel in place pretty much immediately, I think, from what we read there. And of course, we wish them every success in undertaking those important roles. They are very important, busy governance roles, the administrator roles. Of course, we have a couple of administrator panels in place at the moment at Whittlesea and Casey as well. Okay, let's move on. The other big story this week was the release of the coroner's findings looking into the death of the former mayor of the city of Casey, Amanda Stapledon. This is pretty heavy reading, and the coroner has made some observations that have led IBAC to say this week that they will review their practices in light of these findings. Tony, the main thing here seems to be that it doesn't seem to be any intention of bringing criminal proceedings against Ms. Stapledon, but she was not aware of that after about 10 months of those proceedings moving along.
Yeah, so people would probably be familiar with the way IBAC and other organisations like the Ombudsman will release a draft report in a confidential way to those of interest in an inquiry, and that certainly occurred here. There were some indications that that there might be some adverse findings against Councillor Stapledon. She would seem had the view that there may well be some criminal proceedings launched against her, or a recommendation that occur. It would appear from statements from her family and friends made to the coronial inquest that she was fearful of keeping the family home. Where would her disabled son that she was a carer of stay, which ultimately were part of the circumstances that led to her taking her life tragically in January 2022. The challenge for IBAC, which comes through in the corona report, is that their practice has been not to tell people of interest or not to highlight in a report that they're making a recommendation of prosecution, because they're not the final decision maker on that. So if they're so they're making a recommendation to, say, the DPP, and the DPP decide. Now, if they start telling others who are persons of interest that they're not making a recommendation about them, well, the absence of a similar sort of narrative about someone else makes it obvious that they're recommending prosecution about the other person. Now, in light of the sort of tragic circumstances here, there have been some internal reviews at IBAC in terms of their witness welfare processes, and one of the recommendations, or the clear recommendation of the inquest, is that those policy procedural reviews, support for witnesses be upped, and that it be a practice that as soon as possible, once a decision has been made not to recommend a prosecution, that information is communicated to people concerned who are obviously, it's a very traumatic sort of experience to be subject of interest in one of these inquiries.
Absolutely. And Tony, we know that the wording is always very carefully chosen in these reports and these statements, and IBAC's response referred to a review of, I think it was how it carries out its legislation, or the legislation that applies to it. So I'm assuming they've been acting in accordance with an interpretation, a faithful interpretation of what the legislation requires. So there's some grey areas perhaps that are being examined more closely as a result of this.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And I think, to be fair, it has been real challenging circumstances for IBAC here. And there were, it's clear from the coronial report that there were a number of attempts to provide support for Ms. Stapleton and others involved in as persons of interest, and it's just it just another reason to give further impetus to considerations about mental health of people involved in these investigations, and where possible, communicating early on decisions about not proceeding with prosecution when that's made, rather than leave people and their families, with this sort of shadow over their heads and this concern, because people are innocent until proven guilty anyway. That's the process, and that's one of the reasons why IBAC are sort of very careful about language and how they deal with persons of interest.
All right, we might leave that one there and move on to a related item, because that was all about Operation Sandon, the report into which is yet to be seen, but it looks like its release might be getting closer, because we understand from media reports that the developer, John Woodman, has lost a Supreme Court challenge or a request for an injunction for the release of the Operation Sandon report. Julie, that hit late last week, I believe, and the general feeling is that this might clear the way for the release of that report sooner rather than later now.
Yeah, that's right, Chris. And it was interesting because the reports are saying that around mid-May, Mr. Woodman became aware of the fact that IBAC was going to table their report in Parliament and that it was imminent. And so then he filed a summons, an interim injunction to restrain the publication of that report, and saying that he would suffer catastrophic and irreparable damage. So this is going to be a pretty dynamite report, I think, coming out. I think we knew that all along. I think there's going to be huge impacts across the sector. And I keep telling people you need to watch out for this report and you need to read it, because I think that, it's been well sought after for such a long time to understand what's gone on and how that's going to impact on the way that particularly we're going to do planning in the future, because this is all about, planning issues and dealing with developers. So yep, look, hopefully that'll mean now that IBAC can release the report. I'm hoping to see it sooner rather than later. I think they were talking about later this year, but I'm thinking, is there anything else that's holding it up? I don't know. I mean, let's see the report.
Here, Julie, and I imagine we'll need to devote some time, if not a special episode, to unpacking that report when it does hit. Tony, I'm assuming the reason Mr. Woodman sought the injunction is he would have seen an advance copy of that report and had the opportunity to respond to issues raised?
That is the usual practice. In fact, it's normally set out in the legislation that process occur. It was interesting. I think the Supreme Court made some pretty critical comments about, the I think he said early egregious delay in bringing these proceedings, bringing them in May. The request for an interim injunction based on an alleged lack of procedural fairness. When there had been other proceedings brought by Mr. Woodman last year where these sort of claims had not been raised. What seems to be clear from the Supreme Court case is that any notion that holding a public hearing amounts to a breach of natural justice because it necessarily impacts upon people's, reputations during the proceeding. It's been ruled out that, that amounts to a breach of natural justice. I think the court said that was a likely and inevitable outcome of public hearings, but that is the nature of IBAC proceedings, and they weren't prepared to sort of entertain the arguments in favour of an interim injunction.
All right, so we continue to wait, but perhaps it's getting a bit closer. I know a lot of people, as Julie said, are hanging on the release of that report to see what it might entail and what might follow in terms of changes. A couple of stories out of Knox City Council this week. The first one relating to kindergarten provision. A lot of people would be aware that Knox perhaps runs directly more kindergartens than many councils do. And with the foreshadowed changes that are coming from the state in terms of free kindergarten and other changes to the system, Knox has now said they need to review their position in relation to the provision of kindergartens. Who wants to have a go at this one? Julie, you're nodding wisely here, knowingly.
I've got to say though, Chris, I've got a bit of a conflict in this one because I'm proud to be a kindergarten graduate from a Knox kindergarten.
Well, there you go.
Give me their most famous alumni, Julie.
I've got a soft spot for kindergartens in Knox, beautiful.
The most famous alumni of the Knox kindergarten. Very good.
I know, fantastic place. I've still got a photo of me climbing the tree at the kindergarten, which I
please
treasure.
share. Please share.
No, never. But look, it's interesting. They're looking at their options at the moment, which is I think a fair and reasonable thing to do, because there's a lot of changes that have happened in the kindergarten space. So what they're looking at, I think they're looking at maybe reducing the number of sites where it offers kindergarten, and increasing to 15 hours a week for all 3 and 4 year olds, providing sessional kindergarten only at the Knox Children and Family Centres in Bayswater and Wantirna South, and potentially no longer providing sessional kindergarten. So they're considering their options. I think this is a fair and reasonable thing for Knox to do. We have to continue to review services at each council on a regular basis. If we don't, we remain stagnant. I think it's a fair and reasonable call by Knox, but it will be very emotional,
It'll be challenging. Just try and take any sort of service away from a community, and people are going to come out in opposition of that. And I've already seen some commentary from certain quarters that are urging the council not to pull back in this space. But as Julie says, Tony, it's incumbent upon the council to undertake these sorts of reviews from time to time.
Absolutely, and there are enormous changes to the kindergarten sector looming, with I think some really fabulous decisions in terms of making 3-year-old kindergarten free. I never went to kindergarten at all because my parents couldn't afford it. Now 4-year-old kindergarten's paid for, but similarly, a lot of children get to use 3-year-old kindergarten and socialise, and that's not available to some families who just that can't afford it. But there is a cost of the provision of those services, and as you say, rightly so, for council to consider. So there's going to be a council meeting on the 19th of June that will consider that some of those 3 options. Whatever the decision that is made, there'll continue to be kindergarten services for children and parents in the city of Knox. It's just a question of whether council will be as directly involved as they have been. The agenda for that meeting will come out next week, so we'll probably have a much better idea of what is being recommended to councillors in that regard.
We'll check that out next week. Knox also in the news over a stand it's taken on a housing development that's been approved by the state on a former school site. The council and the mayor there, Marcia Timmers-Leach, say it's an overdevelopment, and the council's concerns here have not been taken into account, Tony.
Yeah, another week, another call in by the Minister, Sonia Kilkenny. I think as Julie and yourself said last week, Chris, on another matter, we're probably going to see more of these. This is an application for about 150 homes on a former school site, an 8-hectare site, the Baronia Heights school site, was rezoned back in 2017. As you say, council rejected plans for residential development here. The mayor, as you say, Marcia Timmers-Leach, has come out and reiterated that the council, is supportive of medium density housing development, but would prefer to see that occur around activity centres as per the Plan Melbourne document. Council's concerns were about proximity to public transport, shopping, other services, but it seems that the government are really keen to act when there's opportunities for particularly social housing. And as Julie said, I think we're going to see more of this in the future.
Watch this space. I know the Mayor has said they're seeking an urgent meeting with the Minister to discuss their concerns, and perhaps they're thinking it's not too late to have some of those changes made. So we'll wait and see if that bears fruit. Not sure what
and I think in that circumstance, Chris, it is better to go in and try and negotiate, I think, the design or the outcome, maybe the number of houses, because with these kind of sites, when you look at it from a planning perspective, I mean, they are ripe for development. There are so many examples across Metro Melbourne where this has occurred, where the government has sold off school sites and built some housing estates, which have all had opposition and all gone ahead. So I think that really looking at the design and maybe the number of homes could be negotiated, and that's probably the best that the council's going to get, is what my view would be, because the government are on an agenda of trying to provide the much needed housing that we need to provide on these sites in Metro Melbourne. We are running out of homes. Our population is growing. We are going to be the largest city in Australia, if not already.
If not already,
Yeah, that's right. And, we need to provide these homes. So these kind of sites are ripe for the picking. It's just about the design of them, etc. I do understand and appreciate that the government's policy is that, higher density needs to be around activity centres. Absolutely agree with that. So it's an interesting one. Didn't have a chance to have a look at it in detail. But, again, it's just what's happening across Melbourne.
And of course, you bring your planning background to bear on that consideration, Julie, which is really appreciated. Similar stuff happening in New South Wales, particularly across Sydney, with lots of government announcements about housing investment, etc. Lots of mayors coming out and saying not enough community consultation. You're right, we're reaching a point where the local community considerations and the drive of governments to deliver housing is starting to abut. And I think we'll see a lot more of these government decisions that are overriding perhaps local community sentiments. So watch this space.
We'll probably see from the IBAC report, maybe even some changes, who knows. But, I think that this is going to impact the planning system. So if it does impact the planning system, what is this going to mean? Is this going to mean that there are going to be less decisions made by council, more made by state government? I don't know. But, that's why I think that, the IBAC report is worth consideration, and how that might change things from the planning decision perspective.
You'd have to say, I think that something is broken at the moment, and when you look at we're building 10% of the demand for housing. We're actually servicing 10% at the moment across Australia. And yet you have a lot of residential builders going bust. So in a period where there's really high demand for housing, and we've got, of course, rental rates booming as well. So, I can understand that there's probably a need for some level of drastic reform. In the past, governments have addressed this by feeding the demand equation, putting money in people's pockets as first home buyers to bid prices up, rather than at the supply end. And, there does seem to be some, agreed position out there amongst the experts that we need to work on better supply, not just feeding into the demand part of the equation.
Thanks for your thoughts on that one. Just to note quickly in passing, happy to talk about it if you want to. The CEO of Port Phillip released a statement late yesterday. This is another council decision about a Drag Storytime event. It's Pride Month, and the story is that Port Phillip was finalising its program of events for the month. It included consideration of a Drag Storytime event. A flyer was circulated early before the final decision was made, apparently. But in the meantime, a risk assessment looking into security and safety concerns landed on the side of let's not hold this event in person. We'll hold it at the St Kilda Library, was the plan. We'll hold it online instead. And we've got yet another local government leader coming out having to condemn hate speech and the behaviour that's being experienced at the moment.
Look, I think they've done their due diligence. They've had a look at what they could do instead. Going online is a really good idea to minimise that risk. But it's just, I just shake my head. I just think, gosh, isn't it a shame that we're going through this? I thought we'd moved on from this kind of behaviour from the community, but we obviously haven't.
Clearly we're not. And correct me if I'm wrong, Port Phillip it's one of the more LGBTIQ plus friendly areas in Metro Melbourne, is it not?
That's right. Yeah, that's a very good point. And I'm really surprised by that. But look, good on them for continuing on, going online. At least they can provide that service in a different way that is safe. But, that's all they can do.
Tony, I don't know what your thoughts are, but it sort of occurs to me that the more we have these decisions to postpone or change the way these events are delivered, the more wins the haters are getting. Doesn't that just embolden them to continue this MO that's clearly working?
I certainly see that argument. I certainly understand from a council perspective, health and safety, not just of attendees, members of the public, but the CEO's got an obligation in relation to the library staff and employees of the council. I think that both sides of the argument will always say that this is about the children, and I suspect that for both sides of the argument here, it's not really about the children. That's my so it's a political statement from both sides of the argument here. We're here and we're proud. We're out in the community, supporters versus we're against. We have a moral or an ethical position or religious position on these issues, so we're condemning it. I think they're both sides of the argument are using the opportunity to talk to these often toddlers, use them for political purpose. And I just wonder whether it's the right place to have the debate, frankly.
Yeah, good point. I just wonder where it all ends. I guess we'll find out. Last week, I told you about the two councillors at the City of Salisbury in South Australia who were at risk of being removed for not turning up to at least 3 council meetings in a row. And we wondered whether those two councillors would take the opportunity to respond and indicate why they should not be removed. So a quick update for you. They did not respond by the deadline that the council had set, but they then the council received a request from the legal representatives of those two councillors for more time to make a submission. That submission is due in today as we speak, and the council has put off its consideration of the expulsion, if I can call it that, to a special meeting next week. So we'll have another update on that one next week. Blue Mountain City Council in the news this week over a couple of issues. One is the ongoing disruptions to council meetings. I'll come back to that in a second. But Tony, Julie, I wondered about your thoughts on this. The councillors there have, for the second year running, rejected their increase in pay, which was set at 3%, plus the increase to their super. They've diverted it this year to emergency services funding. I think last year it was road repairs. We're talking about 40K, not quite 40K. But the comment that caught my year was the Mayor, Mark Greenhill, saying, we've done this in solidarity with our community who are feeling the impacts of climate change and therefore putting our raises to emergency services funding. I think we talked about this last year and we wondered whether it would set a precedent. I still think Blue Mountains is the only one doing it.
You're right. They did it last year.
Yeah.
I think the money went to roads last year. In New South Wales, there's a local government, remuneration tribunal that makes these decisions about recommended increases in allowances. This year it was a 3% recommendation, the same as last year. I'd say what Blue Mountains are doing is also consistent, though, with what the state MPs are doing. I think there's been an announcement across the board, or even legislation across the board, that the state MPs won't get a pay rise this year, given the emergency services levy that's come in. I think it's as you say, it's the amount of money is not going to change the world, but it's a gesture from those councillors that they're aware of the cost of living issues in their community, and they don't see it as a good time to, take what was a modest pay rise. I mean, they're on, $50-something thousand allowance a year, most of them. It would have translated into, hundreds of dollars each, I imagine, or maybe $1,000 or so each.
Yeah, and just on that, I mean, they're not earning huge money. Some of them don't have other jobs. Some do. But Julie, what about the argument that's coming from other councils where they're considering the same thing, that we're impacted by cost of living pressures as well? Why should we forego a pay rise when others are getting it out in the community?
That's right, Chris. So there are arguments both sides. I do question whether this one is a bit more political, whether it's a bit more about sending a message to the government to say, hang on a minute, what you're funding in terms of, emergency services to support councils is not enough. So we're going to tell you that this is what we're prepared to do to get a message back to you. So it's not enough, and we're having to forego now out of our own pockets to fund the impact of emergency services. We know that emergency services cost to local government is huge. So I just wonder whether there is a message in that, a political message in that as well. And it could be that, that's what it's about. It may not be. But yeah, look, I think you're right. I think the amount that councillors get paid is really quite low, considering the enormous amount of time that they put into the job. And to forego that when they know that the increasing cost to them for their lives is as much as everybody else. It is very honourable, but I do wonder whether it is a political message as well.
And just very quickly, also out of Blue Mountains, that same mayor has called out the conspiracy theorists that are locking up council meetings. They've had a big run of disruptions at their meetings, Tony, just demonstrating that it's not just in Victoria where this is an issue, and an increasing issue.
I think there's a bit of a history there in Blue Mountains. I recall back in during the pandemic, the onset of the pandemic, one of the councillors coming out and talking about, bus loads of anti-vaxxers, conspiracy theorists coming into the area. There's some sort of Blue Mountains freedom movement up there. As you say, more recently, the agitation's been around, things like recognition of LGBTQ plus communities, that sort of thing. It's more than just an Australia-wide phenomenon. It's a worldwide phenomenon, and it's unfortunately something that the sector's grappling with. Will it be something that fades away in we don't see it as much in 2024? I don't know, but you've heard what I think. I think we should be getting on the front foot and bringing in some strong sanctions for disrupting the operation of local government.
Yes, we're still waiting on that front, aren't we? Let's move on to our picks of the week as time is getting away. I want to start with you this week, Julie. What's caught your eye?
Well, Chris, interesting, and we've experienced it here in Australia, but the UK councils are also subject to cyber attacks on councils. Their systems over there are quite sophisticated. When I worked there, I remember that they were even back then, but the Russians have hacked into Gloucester Council's system, causing a major challenging period for them. This criminal group have targeted the council and attempt to extort a ransom payment from the council. So we're seeing more and more of this happening across the sector, not only in Australia, overseas as well. It's a big issue for councils. I know that the audit and risk committees across all councils are very highly alert to this issue, and they are certainly asking lots of questions of the councils about what they're putting in place to minimise these cyber attacks. It's happening everywhere, Chris, and it's really quite worrying. Really quite worrying. They're saying that this group behind the attacks, this Russian group behind the attacks, is also targeting, you know, hospitals, schools, businesses, and other local authorities. So it's pretty serious and very, very sophisticated now.
Yeah, I've discussed this a couple of times on VLGA Connect and on the roundup with cyber security experts. It's not going away. Everyone needs to assume it will happen to them, not that they're lucky that it hasn't, and maybe they'll be unscathed. One of the current ones, Julie, is Dallas City Council, one of the biggest councils in Texas, where back at the start of May, I think it was, they were target of a ransomware attack. A month on, their crisis communications response is being called into question because the major Dallas newspaper has got a hold of the talking points that the communications people gave to the elected members, which was basically, if you're asked, say nothing, refer it back to the council. And they've been criticised for not telling the community what's going on some weeks later. They say, I'd be interested in your take on this, Tony, they say it's because the FBI is investigating and they don't want to get in the way of those proceedings by jeopardising it with any comment that they might make. But in the meantime, people aren't sure what services are still operating and what aren't.
Yeah, there's so much reputational damage that goes on if you're the subject of one of these cyber attacks. There's, as you say, lots of public sector organisations subject to. A lot of law firms in Melbourne have been, and we've been fortunate, but I can tell you our IT manager will often, you know, be called to do some work on out of hours on a weekend because there's been one of these attempts. I think what it will do, it causes organisations like councils, hospitals, other government organisations to consider, you know, ought we be keeping this private data? You know, is there a reason for us to be holding all this data? Because it may be just simply a risk for us. We saw that with, I think, Medicare recently. You know, the data that we gather, do we use it and destroy it, or do we keep it and carry that risk of, you know, how well protected is the data from sort of nefarious operators?
All right. Thank you for that one, Julie. Hot topic, and I think it'll remain a hot topic for some time to come. Your pick of the week couldn't be any different, Tony.
When I saw this story coming out of Hobsons Bay City Council, I was automatically transported to my childhood. My dad sort of lifting me up with my bare feet and putting me in the cut sort of wine barrel and telling me to try to crush all the grapes as we used to do. Right. But the Olives to Oils Festival was held last weekend in Hobsons Bay City Council, and that it saw people drive from all over Melbourne, in fact, with their olives to the Newport Community Hub there in Hobsons Bay, dropping off olives for processing into olive oil. And the arrangement was that, you know, if you're a Hobsons Bay resident, it was free. If you're from outside Hobsons Bay, there was a very modest sort of, I think, $15 charge. Council sent 6 tonnes of olives away for processing, and sometime in June or July, if you've contributed olives, you can come back and get 10% of the weight of the olives you contributed in olive oil.
Wow.
really popular program. Congrats to Hobsons Bay City Council. The sustainability officer there, Kat Lavers, has said the festival was a really a great success. But I think it's, you know, practical sustainability. A lot of schools participated in this, schools that have, you know, olive trees in their yards. I just thought not only was it sort of celebrating that, you know, ethnic heritage perhaps of some of the Hobsons Bay residents, but also was a real reminder of practical environmental sustainability that councils can encourage in the community.
I was really pleased you picked that one, Tony, because I'd missed it. Kat Lavis has been one of the stars of the Hobsons Bay team for a long time in that environmental space. In fact, I still follow her advice, looking after my lemon tree in a tub faithfully to great effect. So well done, Kat, and to all the team there at Hobsons Bay City Council on that event last weekend. I've got a pick of the week for you, and it's really an update for Julie, who raised the issue of councils in financial trouble in the UK last week, and one in particular, Woking, which has had commissioners installed because of its really lamentable financial situation. It's become a little clearer this week. The council has stopped all non-essential spending. Think about that if you're running a council. All non-essential spending has been ceased immediately while they grapple with this debt, which is now predicted to be £2.6 billion. We're talking about a small council, Woking Borough Council, with nearly £3 billion in debt. So double that at least for Australian dollars, and you've got the size of the problem. That's extraordinary, isn't it, Julie?
Extraordinary. And no sustainability festivals in Woking in the future.
Well, they might need them.
What an amazing space to be in and to claw back from that. So those commissioners have a huge job ahead of them. So yeah. I wonder, I'd be interested to know what the messages are they're putting out to the community, because how could they possibly have any positive reputation within the community getting to a space like that? So,
well, even at this point, the chief executive is saying to the community that we don't yet understand what the full impact of this will be. It's sort of like, bear with us while we try and work this out. But the restrictions, and I quote, reflect the scale and breadth of the acute financial situation facing the council. The council borrowed hundreds of millions of pounds for regeneration projects, and some of those have gone very bad, those borrowing decisions, and that's largely how they find themselves in this position. So cautionary tale, Tony.
Yeah, Victoria Square was the big one there in Woking Town, I think, and I saw some numbers on it being, you know, council borrowing £750 million for that one development. That, I don't know how they value these things, but they say the reported worth now of the development is £200 million.
All right, let's hope they can find their way out of that. As I mentioned last week, recently we were told on one of our global panels that there's a real fear that some councils will go under in the UK, and perhaps this is one of the councils that was being thought of at the time. All right, I think we've reached the end of the line. Anything to add, Julie?
Oh, just a big shout out to Mount Alexander Shire. I'm heading up your way this weekend. I'm looking forward to some rest and relaxation in your beautiful Shire. So big shout out to the team up there.
Very good. Tony, any final thoughts?
No, it's lovely. Is that Castlemaine? Is that
Castlemaine? Yeah.
Yeah, lovely. Oh, you're in the right spot there. I'm off to Warragul, to Bawbaw this coming week. Was in Marybeck and Moyne this current week. So
I saw your Moyne appearance on LinkedIn there. You were very
being at the Port Fairy Yacht Club. It's a beautiful location, and shout out to Brett Davis and Karen Foster, the mayor, Brett, the CEO, and the team there. It was great. It was a great session, but it would continue to get on the road and share the love.
Stay dry, stay warm, We're heading into the depths of winter now, aren't we? All right, great to have you with us as always and to hear your thoughts on the stories of the week. Never a shortage of things to talk about. My gosh, this might be one of our longer episodes. I think I've just looked at the time. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Julie. Thank you to Tony, your team at Hunt & Hunt Lawyers for continuing to be our sponsors for TGU from VLGA Connect. Just a reminder to folks to subscribe on YouTube or on your podcast player to get all the extra episodes that come to you from VLGA Connect. Oh, and I must put out a reminder to all members of VLGA, councillors at member councils in particular, that we are in the midst of the voting period for the vacancies on the VLGA board. So please make sure you check your email for your instructions and exercise your right to vote there. We'll see you again next week for more TGU. Until then, thanks for watching and listening, and bye for now.